Imagine standing in a ruined city where the streets are empty, the tools still in place, the walls unburned, as if its people simply vanished overnight. No war, no fire, no conqueror, just silence. What if the true destroyer was not sword or flood, but something far smaller, invisible, and relentless: plague? From the Black Death that toppled medieval Europe to mysterious collapses of the Maya, the Indus Valley, and even Bronze Age empires, waves of pestilence have swept through humanity like shadows we could never outrun. Archaeologists dig up skeletons with no wounds of battle but traces of bacteria in their teeth. Myths of wrathful gods punishing mankind may be echoes of forgotten epidemics. Even in the ice of Greenland, scientists find signatures of civilizations erased when plagues emptied villages and silenced minds. What if history's great resets were not accidents, but part of a recurring cycle? Civilizations rising, flourishing, and then falling to invisible enemies again and again. If that's true, then our past, and maybe even our future, is shaped less by kings and wars, and more by microbes whispering through time. Tonight we descend into the echoes of forgotten plagues, following their shadow through ruins, myths, and the silence of history itself. The earth remembers what the living forget. Beneath the soft grass of London's fields, under quiet Italian orchards, and hidden below the cobbled stones of medieval towns, lie pits of silence. These are not battlefields. They are graves dug in haste, filled with men, women, and children, laid together without ritual. The soil holds them in layers, as if history itself was overwhelmed by urgency, unable to keep up with the dead. Their bones still whisper a story, that plagues do not just claim lives, they reset the order of the world. The Black Death is the most famous of these shadows. In the mid-14th century, the pestilence swept across Europe, Asia, and North Africa. Entire villages vanished, their doors left swinging in the wind. Monks who recorded the death tolls soon died themselves, leaving pages unfinished. Merchants, lords, peasants, and kings all fell without distinction. Some cities lost half their population in a single year. But this was not merely a tragedy measured in lives. It was a turning of the wheel. Fields lay untended, economies collapsed, feudal orders unravelled. Power shifted from landowners to survivors who suddenly found their labour more valuable. Out of death came social transformation. The chronicles are vivid and unsettling. In Florence, Giovanni Boccaccio described the city reeling in horror. Parents abandoned children, neighbours locked themselves indoors, processions of corpses wound their way through empty streets. In London, carts rumbled through the alleys at night, voices crying out, "Bring out your dead." In Avignon, so many bodies were lowered into the Rhone River that the current itself became swollen with the dead. The plague's touch was both intimate and colossal. Intimate in the way it invaded households, colossal in the way it reshaped kingdoms. And yet, the Black Death was not unique. Archaeologists unearth mass graves far older, filled with bones that bear no marks of weapons, no trauma of war. At East Smithfield in London, beneath the heart of a city that endured countless sieges, a vast pit tells a quieter story. Here, the soil records a moment when people fell faster than they could be buried. In Lübeck, Germany, one excavation revealed layers of skeletons stacked hurriedly, their positioning so haphazard that archaeologists knew they were interred in panic. In Montpellier, France, an entire cemetery was suddenly expanded to accommodate plague victims. The graves tightly packed, often without coffins, a people racing to keep pace with mortality. These sites are portals, not just to the past, but to the possibility that pandemics have always lurked as the hidden architects of history. They reveal a truth rarely spoken, that when we speak of collapsed cities, of abandoned fields, of civilizations fading into silence, we may not be looking at the work of conquest, but the echo of disease. To see plague only as an event of the Middle Ages is to miss its deeper rhythm. Modern science has reached into the marrow of ancient skeletons and pulled out something remarkable: the DNA of the pathogens themselves. Yersinia pestis, the bacterium behind plague, has been found in remains centuries older than the Black Death, hinting at an even longer dance between humanity, and invisible enemies. But even without the aid of modern genetics, the graves themselves tell the story. The archaeology of plague is strange because it is not marked by ruins of walls or charred temples. It is marked by speed and silence. Tools lie unused, hearths cold, harvests uncollected. An economy unravels not with fire but with absence. We find coins buried hastily as though their owners never returned. We find looms and forges abandoned mid-work, tasks interrupted by fever. The cities remain, but they are hollow, as if life itself evaporated. Even the living landscapes of Europe still carry scars. In parts of England, deserted medieval villages sit beneath fields that have been ploughed for centuries. Names survive only in parish records, but the stones of old churches remain. Their emptiness is not due to conquest. It is due to depopulation so severe that communities never recovered. In Ireland, oral traditions speak of the Great Mortality, as though it were a shadow that swept the land, leaving ghost towns and empty hearths. The silence that followed plague became fertile ground for myth. In villages where half the population perished, survivors explained the catastrophe in terms of divine punishment or demonic presence. Medieval woodcuts depict skeletal horsemen riding through towns. The dance of death, a grim reminder that no one could escape. Yet behind the allegory lies something more mundane and more haunting. The microbial world quietly reshaping the destiny of humanity. This is the thesis we begin with. What if the true resets of civilization were not always floods or wars, but cycles of plague? What if buried beneath myths of wrathful gods and lost empires lies the simpler, more terrifying truth that unseen microbes repeatedly swept the slate clean, erasing generations and forcing survivors to build anew? In this sense, plague pits are not just graves, but symbols. They remind us that civilization is fragile, that its continuity rests on invisible balances of health and disease. When those balances are broken, society can collapse not with a roar, but with a whisper. And yet, out of these whispers came change. After the Black Death, Europe saw revolts by labourers, the decline of feudalism, even the stirrings of the Renaissance. The reset cleared space for something new, though at a cost almost beyond comprehension. As the spade uncovers these forgotten bones, a pattern emerges. Civilization advances, then falls into silence, again and again. And each time the survivors carry forward fragments, new customs, altered economies, different beliefs. The old order dissolves, but life in altered form persists. We will leave behind the graves of medieval Europe and reach further back, into the genome, where the pathogens themselves whisper a story older than writing, older even than memory. For if bones tell us of plague's presence, DNA tells us of its endurance, etched into humanity itself. Imagine this. A skeleton lies in the soil of the Eurasian steppe, untouched for 4,000 years. The bones are brittle, the teeth darkened by time. Nothing about this ancient burial speaks of grandeur, no gold, no weapons, no carved stone markers. Yet hidden deep within the molars, preserved like a message sealed in amber, rests a fragment of something invisible, the DNA of a pathogen. When scientists sequenced these remains, they discovered the genetic signature of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for plague. This finding shook the timeline of history. The Black Death of the 14th century had long been thought the true dawn of plague. But here, in Bronze Age bones, lay proof that humanity had faced this enemy far earlier. What if entire communities, perhaps entire cultures, vanished not from drought or war, but from the silent march of disease, long before scribes had ink to record it? The discovery was made possible by advances in paleogenomics, the science of extracting ancient DNA. Teeth, especially molars, act like sealed vaults, protecting fragments of genetic code for thousands of years. Within those blood-rich chambers, scientists found traces not only of plague, but of other diseases too: leprosy, hepatitis, even strains of influenza. Each genetic shard is a ghost, whispering of ancient struggles where survival was never guaranteed. What makes this so powerful is not just the presence of Yersinia pestis, but the timing. These remains date to the Bronze Age, long before medieval Europe. They suggest that plague has haunted humanity since the dawn of complex society. Archaeologists link these findings with the great migrations of Indo-European peoples. Around the same time that plague DNA appears in skeletons, waves of human expansion swept from the steppes into Europe and Asia. Was disease the hidden hand, clearing territories by thinning rival groups and making space for newcomers? Consider the speed of ancient plagues. Unlike wars, which scar the landscape with fire and rubble, pandemics leave subtler marks. A village might be abandoned overnight, its pottery still on the shelves, its fields half-harvested. The pathogens found in these ancient teeth hint at scenarios where entire lineages were erased before they could leave monuments or chronicles. The mystery cultures archaeologists puzzle over, those that appear in fragments and then vanish, may have been undone not by conquest but by contagion. The genome also tells us about adaptation. Some ancient strains of Yersinia pestis lacked certain genes that made the medieval plague so explosively deadly. These early versions may have spread slower, but over centuries they evolved into more virulent forms. Humanity was walking a long corridor with plague, shadowed by an enemy that was learning, refining, becoming more efficient. Every burial site with plague DNA is a marker along that corridor, a reminder that history is not only shaped by human innovation, but by microbial evolution. And myths, once again, align with science. In the Rig Veda, an ancient Sanskrit hymn describes a serpent with 1,000 heads breathing sickness across the land. In Mesopotamian texts, demons of pestilence are loosed by angry gods. These images, though draped in symbolism, carry echoes of cycles where invisible scourges swept through populations. The people who sang and wrote these stories may not have known of bacteria, but they knew the terror of communities falling with no enemy to see. Other traces lie not in myth, but in silence. Around 5,000 years ago, Neolithic settlements in Europe suddenly shrank. Longhouses stood abandoned, burial grounds filled quickly. Archaeologists have debated climate, famine, or conflict, but the genetic evidence of plague in precisely this time frame suggests another possibility. Waves of epidemic thinning populations so swiftly that continuity fractured. The Neolithic collapse may not only have been environmental, but microbial. These findings shift how we see civilization itself. It is not merely a march of progress punctuated by wars and inventions. It is also a struggle for survival against invisible enemies. The genome reveals that every generation has been shaped by microbes, either destroyed by them or hardened through them. Our immune systems are archives of battles fought without monuments. Even more haunting are the ghost populations in our DNA, genetic lineages that appear in our genomes but leave no cultural or archaeological trace. They may represent peoples erased so completely by epidemic that only fragments of their bloodlines persist in us today. Their stories were never carved in stone, but they flow in our veins, silent testimonies of civilizations erased by shadow. The first shadow in the genome tells us something profound. Pandemics were not accidents of the Middle Ages. They were companions of humanity from the beginning, stalking us as silently as wolves in the dark. Our civilizations may have risen on fragile ground, always vulnerable to the next unseen tide. And this brings us back to the graves. When we gaze at a pit filled with bones, hurriedly buried without ritual, we see the aftermath. But when we look into genomes, we see the process itself, the invisible enemy moving through time, leaving genetic footprints where no chronicles remain. From here, the story expands outward. We have peered into bones and found bacteria. We have listened to myths and seen their echoes in science. Now, to grasp the true power of plague, we must move into history's grandest stages, the courts of kings, the streets of Rome, the ports of China, where eyewitnesses recorded not only survival, but collapse. For if the genome whispers, history shouts. That is where we will go next. A city thrives not only on walls and armies, but on the invisible threads of daily life. The crowded marketplace, the soldiers packed in barracks, the ships arriving at harbours heavy with grain and goods. When those threads fray, an empire trembles. and nothing frays them faster than plague. In 430 BCE, Athens was a beacon of democracy and philosophy. The city's walls were strong, its fleet unrivaled, its culture radiant. Yet as war with Sparta dragged on, an invisible enemy slipped through its gates. Thucydides, himself a survivor, described the horror: fever, coughing blood, bodies heaped in temples, customs abandoned as the living struggled simply to survive. Within a few years, a third of Athens had perished, including Pericles, its greatest statesman. The city that had stood as the mind of Greece staggered, and from that wound Athens never truly recovered. Plague tipped the balance of the Peloponnesian War, reshaping the fate of Greece more decisively than any spear or trireme. Centuries later, the Roman Empire faced its own invisible wars. The Antonine Plague, carried home by legions returning from campaigns in the east, swept through the empire from 165 to 180 CE. Some believe it was smallpox, others suspect measles. Whatever the cause, it decimated the population. Roman cities emptied, trade routes faltered, and the very sense of invincibility that had defined Rome began to erode. Inscriptions from the time lament the sheer number of funerals, the exhaustion of priests, the despair of families forced to bury several generations within months. Then came the Plague of Cyprian in the 3rd century, a disease so devastating that entire towns were said to vanish. Contemporary writers describe bodies piled in the streets, the dead left unburied as the living fled. The empire reeled under simultaneous blows: economic crisis, political instability, and waves of illness. Armies shrank, borders weakened, provinces seethed with unrest. By the time the so-called crisis of the 3rd century reached its peak, it was not only invaders at the gates, but disease within the walls that hollowed Rome. And still, the blows did not end. In 541 CE, the Plague of Justinian struck Constantinople. Procopius, the historian, wrote of carts piled high with corpses, of entire households extinguished overnight, of the emperor himself stricken. At its height, thousands died each day. This was not a single outbreak, but a cycle that recurred for 2 centuries, weakening the Byzantine Empire just as new powers rose in Arabia and the steppes. Once again, plague shifted the balance of the world, carving new pathways for history to flow. The East was not spared. The Han dynasty in China, whose reach rivaled Rome in scale, fell in part to internal fractures: corruption, rebellion, warlords. Yet within the chronicles are mentions of sudden pestilences, mysterious illnesses that emptied villages and spread along the arteries of trade. When the dynasty collapsed in 220 CE, it was weakened by more than politics. Its people had already been thinned by waves of disease. Archaeological digs reveal villages abandoned abruptly, burials rushed as though an unseen scythe had passed. These stories reveal a haunting pattern. Empires fall not only because of visible enemies, but because of invisible ones. A single cough in a crowded marketplace could ripple outward to topple kings, to shift borders, to erase centuries of stability. Disease undermined the confidence of rulers and the morale of citizens. It hollowed armies, starved treasuries, and left behind not the drama of conquest, but the emptiness of silence. The imagery of collapse is striking when seen through the lens of plague. Streets once filled with merchants become avenues of silence. Amphitheatres where crowds roared with excitement stand deserted. Granaries overflow not with plenty, but with rats feeding on abandoned stores. Cities do not burn, they wither. And when they are taken by foreign powers, as often happened, they are already shadows of themselves, undone long before swords touch their walls. Plague also served as a leveller, sparing no rank. In Athens, generals and philosophers succumbed beside servants and slaves. In Rome, emperors themselves were not immune. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, is believed to have died during the Antonine Plague. His death marked not only the end of a reign, but the beginning of a long decline. The message was clear. No matter how mighty the throne, it could not command the breath of the sick. What we remember in chronicles are often the wars, the treaties, the shifting dynasties. Yet behind these events, plague lurks like an unacknowledged puppeteer, tugging at the strings of destiny. When maps change, when cities fall silent, when entire eras close, we should ask whether it was truly the sword or the shadow of disease. And so the story drifts further, beyond parchment and chronicles, across oceans to other continents. There, civilizations also rose in splendor and then collapsed in silence, undone not only by conquest, but by invisible waves that traveled ahead of foreign ships. The ruins of the Americas, once filled with voices, would tell their own version of this tale. But the question lingers. If plague could topple Athens, Rome, Byzantium, and Han China, is it not possible that every empire carries within it the seeds of its own erasure, waiting in the breath of the unseen? If you find these echoes of fragility compelling, consider subscribing and share where you are listening from tonight. Do you think plague shaped history more than the sword ever did? Picture the great plazas of Tenochtitlan at its height, canals glistening under the sun, markets teeming with colour, temples rising like mountains of stone. Priests climbed pyramid steps, merchants called out their wares, and thousands thronged the streets. Now imagine the same city, silent. The canals clogged with bodies, the marketplaces abandoned, the temples echoing with prayers for gods who no longer answered. Such was the devastation when plague arrived in the New World. When Europeans set foot in the Americas, they brought more than steel and fire. They carried with them invisible passengers, smallpox, measles, influenza. For peoples with no previous exposure, these diseases were more devastating than armies. In Mexico, smallpox spread faster than Spanish swords, killing rulers, priests, and commoners alike. Historians estimate that within a century of first contact, as much as 90% of the indigenous population across the Americas had perished. Tens of millions of lives erased in silence. Entire civilizations collapsed before they fully understood what had come upon them. The Aztec records preserved in codices speak of pustules covering the body, of fevers so fierce that victims could not move, of families unable to bury their dead. They describe despair more complete than any war. When Hernán Cortés marched into the Valley of Mexico, he confronted not the full strength of an empire, but a people already broken, their emperor Cuauhtémoc leading a nation staggering under invisible blows. The Andes tell a similar story. Before Francisco Pizarro confronted the Inca Empire, disease had already reached its highlands. Smallpox travelled south from Central America along trade networks, arriving before the Spanish themselves. It struck down Huayna Capac, the emperor, triggering a civil war between his sons Atahualpa and Huáscar. By the time Spanish steel clashed with Inca stone, the empire was already weakened from within. The conquistadors faced not a united civilization at its peak, but one fractured and thinned by plague. Yet the story may stretch back even further, beyond Columbus and Cortés, into a time when the Americas were still isolated. Some researchers suggest that earlier contacts, Norse voyagers in Vinland around the year 1000, or even unknown transoceanic visitors hinted at in maps and legends, could have introduced pathogens. While direct proof remains elusive, the sudden decline of certain pre-Columbian societies raises questions. Take Cahokia, near the confluence of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers. At its height around the 12th century, it was larger than London, with earthen mounds rising from the floodplain and tens of thousands of inhabitants. Then, by the 14th century, Cahokia was largely abandoned. Environmental stress played a role, yet some archaeologists wonder if epidemic disease, spreading along trade networks that stretched from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, accelerated the collapse. The fields and plazas stand as silent witnesses to a people who vanished too swiftly for conquest to explain. Even older Andean mummies reveal signs of tuberculosis. Long before Europeans carried their invisible armies westward, diseases were already part of the landscape of the Americas. Some strains may have arisen independently, others perhaps introduced by animals or rare contacts. In the dry air of high-altitude tombs, lesions on the bones speak of lives shortened by infection. These are quiet reminders that plague was not only an old-world companion, but a universal presence, shaping destinies across continents. Myth preserves fragments of this trauma. The Aztec goddess Cihuacoatl was said to walk the streets weeping at night, a warning of coming catastrophe. Some saw her as a mother mourning her children, others as a harbinger of death itself. Among the Maya, cycles of destruction were woven into cosmology, worlds ending not just in floods or fire, but in pestilence that reduced creation to ash before it began again. Such myths may be cultural memories of waves of sickness that thinned populations long before the Spaniards arrived. The scale of these epidemics is almost unimaginable. In the Valley of Mexico, villages vanished entirely. In Central America, fields went unplanted, and temples fell silent as priests succumbed. Along the coasts of New England, when English settlers arrived in the early 1600s, they often found cleared fields and abandoned villages, the result of earlier epidemics likely carried by European fishermen and traders. To colonists, it seemed as if Providence had cleared the land for them. To the native peoples, it was apocalypse. These forgotten epidemics remind us that plague does not need armies to conquer. It moves silently, faster than ships or horses through air, water, and human touch. Its victories are rarely recorded in chronicles of kings, yet they reshape continents more completely than any war. The ruins of the Americas, whether the stone temples of the Inca or the earthen mounds of Cahokia, hold a silence deeper than conquest. The silence of millions lost to diseases they had never known. And yet, silence was not the only inheritance. Survivors carried fragments of memory into ritual and story. They reinterpreted catastrophe as divine will, as punishment or transformation. In doing so, they gave meaning to the inexplicable, preserving the memory of epidemics in symbols and myths rather than records. Even in the absence of writing, the stories endure, painting plagues as gods, demons, or tears of a weeping mother. This blending of trauma and myth was not unique to the Americas. Across the world, people encoded pestilence as divine wrath, weaving it into their cosmologies and rituals. And just as ruins reveal physical absence, myths reveal the psychological imprint of plague, the way invisible enemies were given names and faces so that the living could endure. Long before the microscope revealed the hidden world of microbes, humanity gave plague a face, a name, and a story. Invisible death was too vast, too sudden to be left without meaning. So across cultures, sickness became the weapon of gods, the curse of spirits, or the breath of demons. These myths were not mere superstition. They were attempts to explain resets that struck with terrifying speed, erasing entire generations without warning. In the Hebrew scriptures, the plagues of Egypt unfold like a cosmic trial. Waters turn to blood, the air fills with locusts, boils rise on the skin, and death moves silently through the night. Whether these accounts describe natural calamities or mythic exaggeration, they reveal something deeper. A people encoding memories of catastrophe into story. For the Israelites, the plagues were divine intervention, proof of a God who could humble empires. But perhaps behind the allegory lies an echo of real epidemics that destabilized kingdoms and carved themselves into cultural memory. Mesopotamia too was haunted by pestilence. Clay tablets tell of the god Nergal, lord of the underworld, who unleashed disease upon humanity as punishment. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, pestilence is one of the many tools by which the gods remind mortals of their fragility. And in later Assyrian traditions, the god Era's rampages included not only fire and war, but invisible waves of sickness. Here, plague was not an accident of nature. It was divine wrath, aimed at cleansing pride or overpopulation. The Greeks spoke of Apollo, who with a silver bow could send arrows of pestilence into the ranks of men. In Homer's Iliad, the poem does not begin with a duel of heroes, but with plague. The god strikes the Achaean army, and only after sacrifices and appeasements does the illness relent. Disease here is not a background detail, but the stage setter of epic, a reminder that the fate of armies was not decided solely by swords. In India, the goddess Shitala rides upon a donkey, carrying a pot of cooling water and a broom. She both spreads smallpox and heals it, feared and worshipped in equal measure. Her shrines were places of both dread and comfort, where mothers prayed to spare their children, offering sweets and cooling foods. The rituals surrounding her reveal how communities tried to frame sickness as negotiation, a bargain with the divine rather than an unseen microbe. Across East Asia, plague deities also walked among the people. In Japan, the Goryo, vengeful spirits of those who had died unjustly, were often believed to spread pestilence. Shrines were built to appease them, transforming wrath into protection. The very act of naming the invisible, of personifying disease as a ghost or god, gave society a way to respond. Even the New World held its pantheon of pestilence. Among the Aztec, Tezcatlipoca could send waves of sickness to humble humanity. The Maya spoke of Hunhao, lord of death and disease, ruling over cycles of creation and destruction. In these stories, illness was not random. It was part of the cosmic rhythm, balancing hubris with humility, life with erasure. In medieval Europe, Christian imagery painted plague as the hand of God. Chroniclers of the Black Death wrote of processions of flagellants, men who whipped themselves through the streets in hope of appeasing divine anger. Woodcuts depicted the danse macabre, the dance of death, where skeletons led kings, popes, and peasants alike in grim procession. Pestilence became a reminder that all were equal in the eyes of mortality. What these myths share is an insistence on meaning. Plague was too terrible to be meaningless, so it became message. Each pustule, each cough, each fever was framed as the voice of gods, as judgment or warning. For survivors, this framing offered endurance. It turned random catastrophe into narrative, and narrative into memory. Sometimes the myths even offered guidance. Rituals of purification, processions of penance, offerings to pestilence gods, all became ways to order chaos, to provide a semblance of control. In their repetition, communities found solidarity. Fear was transformed into action even when the action had no medical efficacy. And when myths endured, they carried fragments of ancient trauma into the future. The memory of pestilence was folded into cosmology, where destruction was always followed by renewal. In Hindu tradition, each yuga cycle carries decline into darkness, where plague and famine thin humanity before a new golden age begins. In Norse mythology, Ragnarok's flames are preceded by Fimbulwinter and the spread of disease, only for the world to be reborn green and fresh. Myth ensured that plague was never forgotten, not as accident, but as part of the deep rhythm of existence. To walk through these stories is to sense the echo of ancient grief disguised as theology. Behind the masks of gods and demons, one hears the sobs of families, the silence of villages, the terror of sudden disappearance. The myths are not lies, they are vessels, carrying the unbearable into forms that could be told and retold. And in the ruins of abandoned towns, or in the ritual sites where offerings still lie buried, we see how these myths were lived. Pestilence was not only endured but sanctified, inscribed into the architecture of shrines, the symbols of art, the dances and prayers of generations. The invisible enemy became part of the visible culture, immortalized in ways science has only recently begun to decode. Through myth, plague was given memory. Through memory, it became part of identity. And in that identity lies the proof that pandemics were never just interruptions. They were forces so profound that they reshaped belief itself, teaching humanity that survival required both endurance and story. Walk among the ruins of a city long abandoned, and you will notice a peculiar silence. Walls still stand. Streets still stretch in familiar lines. Pottery lies where it was left, as if the inhabitants had simply stepped away and never returned. These are not the scars of war, where fire blackens stone and weapons lie scattered. They are the scars of absence, a sudden thinning of people, an emptying that leaves architecture intact but lifeless. Consider the cliff dwellings of the ancestral Puebloans in the American Southwest. For centuries, these communities carved entire villages into canyon walls, with kivas for ceremony and storerooms stocked for survival. Then, by the 13th century, many were deserted. Archaeologists often point to drought as the chief cause. Yet drought alone may not explain the swiftness or totality of abandonment. In some settlements, food stores remained partly full, tools left in place. Imagine a people vanishing mid-season, leaving hearths still blackened with the last fire. Could epidemic disease, silent and invisible, have driven survivors to flee or collapse entirely? The stones cannot answer, but their stillness whispers possibility. The Indus Valley offers another enigma. Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were once thriving urban centres, with advanced drainage systems and organised streets. Then, around 1900 BCE, the civilization declined. Traditional explanations cite changing rivers, failing trade, and climate shifts. Yet in Mohenjo-Daro's streets, archaeologists found clusters of skeletons lying as if struck suddenly, their homes otherwise undisturbed. No signs of battle, no fires of conquest. Could contagion have moved swifter than armies, leaving these advanced cities hollow almost overnight? Across the Mediterranean, gaps appear as well. After the late Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE, dozens of once great cities fell silent. Some show evidence of war and fire, others simply emptied, leaving walls intact and fields gone fallow. Archaeologists sift through abandoned granaries, storerooms with vessels still stacked neatly, and wonder why no one returned. Disease, spreading faster than knowledge or hope, may have driven populations into such decline that rebuilding was impossible. Closer to our own time, England and France are littered with the husks of deserted medieval villages. Archaeologists map them by the faint outlines of walls beneath grassy fields, or by the lone church tower that still stands amid farmland. Many were abandoned during the Black Death, when entire communities perished and survivors resettled elsewhere. The landscape itself holds these absences like faint scars, visible to those who know how to look. Walk through such a field at dusk, and the silence feels unnatural, as though the earth remembers voices that no longer echo there. In Scandinavia, abandoned farmsteads tell a similar tale. Archaeological surveys reveal entire valleys where homesteads vanished in the wake of medieval plague. The soil records a pause in agriculture, the forests creeping back over ploughed fields, nature reclaiming what had been cleared. These quiet returns of wilderness are themselves scars of disease, the land expanding where people once held it at bay. The archaeology of plague is subtle. Unlike battle, which leaves shattered walls and weapons, plague leaves interruption. A loom abandoned mid-weave, a pot left half-filled, a child's toy forgotten in the dirt. In such moments, time itself seems to fracture. The ordinary rhythm of daily life stops, frozen as though hands were stilled in the very act of use. These are details often overlooked, but they speak of lives ended not with drama, but with silence. Myths sometimes arose around these ruins, centuries later, when descendants stumbled upon the husks of empty towns. Folklore told of curses, of gods who had smitten the people for arrogance, of witches who drained life from villages. The truth may have been simpler, microbes moving invisibly through breath and touch. But for survivors without explanation, only story could fill the void. The ruins themselves became haunted places, reminders of fragility. Even great monuments, seemingly eternal, may carry scars of plague. At Angkor in Cambodia, the Khmer Empire's sprawling capital shows signs of sudden decline in the 14th century. Droughts and political strife contributed, but scholars also suggest epidemics may have struck the crowded city, accelerating its abandonment. Stone towers still rise above the jungle canopy, their carvings of dancing apsaras unbroken, but the silence beneath them tells of a vanished population. What is haunting about these scars is their invisibility. Stones endure, people do not. And when the people vanish, the stones remain as mute witnesses, their survival making absence more striking. A city without walls can be explained by conquest. A city with walls still standing, yet utterly empty, forces us to confront other possibilities. Each ruin is like a photograph, capturing the moment just after a breath has stopped. And when placed side by side, the Indus Valley, the Puebloan cliffs, the medieval villages, they suggest a pattern too vast to ignore. The cycles of plague ripple across geography and centuries, leaving behind not ruins of fire, but ruins of silence. And silence does not remain only in architecture. It can be traced in the air itself, in the chemistry of ice, and the long memory of the Earth. The breath of ancient pandemics is still trapped in glaciers, waiting to be read. The scars carved into stone find their echo in frozen layers, where absence is recorded in chemical signatures, silent but undeniable. Do these abandoned cities suggest that history was shaped less by invaders and more by unseen waves of disease? I'd love to hear your perspective. And don't forget to subscribe if you want to journey deeper. Deep in Greenland, where glaciers have pressed upon themselves for millennia, lies a library without words. Each winter snow falls. Each summer it compresses, layer upon layer, until centuries become strata. Scientists who drill into this frozen archive are, in effect, unrolling the atmosphere of the past. Within the ice lie traces of volcanoes, of forest fires, of human industry, and, curiously, of silence. In cores dated to the mid-14th century, researchers found something unexpected, a sharp drop in lead pollution. Medieval Europe was a land of constant smelting, its furnaces feeding coinage, weapons, and construction. Yet suddenly, activity halted. The air grew cleaner. The ice remembers what the chronicles sometimes gloss over, that the Black Death so reduced populations, so emptied workshops and mines, that even the sky grew stiller. The plague is recorded not just in graves, but in breath itself. The story does not end there. A second dip, centuries earlier, aligns with the Plague of Justinian. Around the year 541, volcanic ash dimmed the skies, crops failed, and disease spread across the Byzantine world. In ice cores, levels of certain gases and pollutants declined dramatically as human activity shrank. The signal is faint but unmistakable. The earth itself inhaled less smoke, less metal, fewer signs of human toil, because the hands that made them had fallen still. Tree rings add their voices to this frozen choir. In northern Europe, narrow rings mark years of slowed growth during the 6th century, corresponding with volcanic winter and famine. Together with the ice, they show a global moment when nature's pulse faltered, not just from ash, but from the collapse of human labour. Plague and volcano combined, and the silence was written both in wood and ice. Imagine these ice cores as transparent scrolls. Under magnification, bubbles of ancient air appear, trapped like beads of glass. A scientist leans close, and in those tiny orbs lies a breath exhaled by someone who lived centuries ago. A breath containing hints of the world as it was. The ratio of gases, the dust, the traces of metal, all speak of a civilization's vigour or its absence. To pierce such a bubble is to inhale history itself. This way of reading the Earth reveals pandemics as ecological resets. When populations collapsed, forests crept back into abandoned fields, absorbing carbon. Rivers flowed more clearly, mines fell silent, animals reclaimed empty villages. In this sense, plague acted as a hidden gardener, reshaping landscapes as much as it reshaped societies. Some researchers even speak of a little ice age, partially intensified by reforestation after the great die-offs in the Americas following European contact. The air itself grew colder and clearer because millions no longer farmed or burned wood. The haunting thought is that plagues write their stories across the globe, in places far from the graves of the dead. The Greenland ice sheet carries traces of the despair of Florence and Constantinople. The Antarctic glaciers hold echoes of Peru and Mexico. Invisible threads link distant lands, all bound by a microbial tide that reduced the breath of humanity. Even myths may reflect this planetary silence. In Irish annals, monks wrote of a failure of bread and a year without a summer, while Chinese records describe a dim sun and falling temperatures. Beneath their words lie the same disruptions visible in ice. For ancient people, it was divine punishment or celestial omen. For modern science, it is chemistry and isotopes. Yet both point to the same truth. Something vast had unsettled the rhythm of life. And so the ice, cold and impartial, becomes a mirror. Each layer is a frozen page, preserving moments of erasure and renewal. One century, the signature of smelters and fires. The next, a pause, a silence, a thinning of human presence. Like the deserted villages scattered across Europe, the ice carries memory, but on a planetary scale. To imagine these signals is to see plague as more than a human story. It becomes a dialogue between people and planet, between breath and sky. Each collapse leaves two kinds of ruins, those built of stone and those inscribed in air. Together they remind us that civilization is not only fragile, but porous, our fate entwined with the chemistry of the earth itself. And where stone shows us absence, ice shows us breath. Both are silences, each in its own way, each pointing toward the same unsettling conclusion, that even when voices fade, the world remembers. In the year 536, the sun dimmed. Chroniclers from across the world, from Byzantium to China, from Ireland to the Middle East, recorded a sky darkened by haze, a sun that gave no warmth, and harvests that failed. For 18 months, the world lived in a twilight of volcanic dust. Crops withered, famine spread, and into this fragile silence came plague. Just 5 years later, in 541, the Plague of Justinian erupted in Constantinople. Procopius, who witnessed it, described streets piled high with corpses and ships drifting into harbours with no living crew. Some days saw 10,000 deaths in the capital alone. The empire faltered, its armies unable to muster strength, its cities emptied. What had once been the might of Rome reborn was hollowed by invisible breath. The timing was no coincidence. Volcanic eruptions had already weakened societies across the globe, plunging them into scarcity. Malnutrition thinned defences, migrations spread disease more swiftly, and despair left populations vulnerable. Plague often follows disaster, not as rival, but as companion. Contemporary evidence deepens the picture. Tree rings from Europe and Asia narrow sharply during this period, proof of years when crops struggled to grow. Ice cores reveal volcanic sulfate from eruptions in Iceland and perhaps further afield, spreading aerosols across the stratosphere. Chinese chronicles describe frost in midsummer, while Mediterranean writers lament skies dimmed like a perpetual eclipse. The world was already wounded by ash when pestilence swept in. This partnership of catastrophe has echoes in older timeframes. Around 74,000 years ago, the Toba supereruption in present-day Indonesia released a cloud of ash so vast it may have shrouded the planet for years. Genetic studies suggest humanity experienced a bottleneck soon after, our numbers dwindling perilously low. Climate stress alone may not explain such severity. Waves of epidemic, preying on weakened populations, may have delivered the deeper blow. If so, plague was not just a traveller of empires, but a force that shaped the very survival of our species. Even myths seem to entwine fire and pestilence. Norse sagas speak of Fimbulwinter, a long season of cold and darkness that precedes Ragnarok. The Aztec remembered cycles where sun and earth collapsed together, ending with famine and disease. In Hindu cosmology, the Kali Yuga is marked by corruption, hunger, and plague, as though collapse is never singular but woven from many threads. Myth carries memory not of a single calamity, but of converging ones, remembered as divine choreography. Archaeology reinforces this intertwining. Excavations of Byzantine towns show sudden abandonment, storerooms left full yet untouched. In some cemeteries, mass graves suggest rapid mortality, while nearby layers of volcanic ash reveal natural disaster pressing upon the same moment. The combination is unmistakable, one catastrophe weakening the body, another finishing the work. This motif repeats across history. When Tambora erupted in 1815, causing the year without a summer, global harvests failed. In the years following, cholera spread widely across Asia and into Europe, exploiting weakened populations. Famine opened the door, plague stepped through it. The pattern is one of cascading events, each amplifying the next until societies buckle. The memory of ash and plague is not only geological or archaeological, it lingers in landscapes. Forests that once fed on abandoned fields bear silent witness to those who never returned. Villages rebuilt on volcanic slopes carry stories of ancestors who died not only from ashfall but from sickness in the aftermath. Oral traditions in the Pacific speak of islands emptied by fire from the sky, followed by wasting fevers. Though centuries have passed, the dual trauma remains braided in cultural memory. What emerges from these layers of evidence and story is a haunting motif. Catastrophes rarely travel alone. Fire, famine, and plague move together, compounding each other's destruction. Civilizations are not only undone by a single strike, but by cascading waves of calamity, where one disaster opens the door for the next. It is this interplay, the earth shuddering, the air darkening, the body succumbing, that explains why some collapses seem so total, why memory itself struggles to survive. And if ash could magnify plague, so too could water. Floods displace, crowding survivors into small refuges. Drowned lands force migrations, and with movement comes contagion. Ancient myths that speak of worlds swallowed by the sea may also preserve echoes of invisible waves that followed, sickness moving as silently as water itself. In this way, the ruins remembered as drowned or swallowed may carry within them not only the story of flood, but of fever. In Plato's telling, Atlantis vanished in a single day and night of misfortune, earthquakes, floods, and the sea swallowing an empire. For centuries, seekers have searched for the sunken land, drawn to the image of a civilization drowned. Yet what if the true catastrophe was not only water rising over stone, but an invisible tide moving through the survivors? What if plague accompanied flood, erasing not just land but memory? Flood myths are nearly universal. The Aztecs spoke of a world destroyed by water, leaving only a handful of survivors. The Maya told of previous creations washed away, their remnants becoming shadows of the present world. In Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh describes the flood that annihilated humankind, a tale echoed in Genesis. Each myth remembers water, yes, but woven into these stories are hints of pestilence that followed. After floods, disease thrives. Standing waters breed insects. Crowded survivors, huddled on rafts or mountaintops, become fertile ground for contagion. Even in more recent centuries, history confirms the pattern. After the Yellow River burst its banks in imperial China, records tell of famines swiftly followed by waves of epidemic that claimed as many lives as the water itself. In 19th century Bengal, flooding carried cholera into villages like an army of ghosts, sweeping faster than any wave. The link between rising water and spreading sickness is so consistent that it seems almost inevitable. Catastrophe rarely travels alone. Perhaps this is the unspoken layer within Atlantis, a land overwhelmed not only by waves but by pestilence. Imagine survivors clinging to high ground, weakened by hunger, fever spreading through clustered families. The sea erases the city, the sickness erases the story. What remains for descendants is only the image of the ocean swallowing everything. The fever, too horrible to recount or too easily forgotten once it passed, fades from memory, leaving only flood to bear the weight of myth. Legends of lost lands around the world carry similar textures. The Polynesians told of islands that slipped beneath the waves, their people scattered like driftwood. The memory is always of drowning, yet oral traditions often hint at wasting sickness that struck in the aftermath. In northern Europe, Doggerland, the great plain that once connected Britain to the continent, was swallowed by rising seas at the end of the Ice Age. Archaeological finds suggest rich hunting grounds and human settlements now beneath the North Sea. If survivors fled inland, gathering in tighter groups, disease may have accompanied their migrations, adding another layer to the loss. In the Andes, flood myths intertwine with tales of plagues sent by angry gods. High in the mountains, oral histories describe villages destroyed first by water, then by fevers that carried away those who had survived. Even in Egypt, where the Nile was usually a giver of life, years of excessive flooding brought not abundance, but pestilence. Mosquitoes, stagnant waters, and crowded shelters turned blessing into curse. The symbolism of Atlantis itself is telling. Plato presents it as a civilization of hubris, punished for pride. That theme echoes myths from across the world where gods use catastrophe to humble mortals. But what if the real punishment was the cycle of ecological collapse followed by epidemic? Hubris builds cities on floodplains or draws populations too tightly together, and nature answers with water and plague. Archaeology offers fragments that may align with such interpretations. Excavations in Mediterranean coastal towns show sudden layers of abandonment coinciding with tsunamis or quakes, yet skeletal remains sometimes bear lesions of disease. Catastrophe from earth and sea was compounded by catastrophe within the body. In such moments, it is easy to see how myth would compress both terrors into a single, unforgettable story. The haunting truth is that memories of water are easier to preserve than memories of microbes. Floods leave landscapes altered, shorelines redrawn, entire lands submerged. Disease leaves no monuments. Survivors tell of the roar of waves, the thunder of storms, but fevers and coughs dissolve into silence once they pass. Thus, in myth, flood becomes eternal, while plague becomes invisible. Yet if we read carefully, the invisible still flickers through. In the Aztec account of the 5 suns, after one world ended in flood, the next succumbed to jaguars, the next to fire, and another to pestilence. Each reset of creation folded water and disease together, reminding listeners that destruction is seldom singular. Myths of Atlantis and its kin may therefore be less about geography than about memory, cultural attempts to encode the unbearable complexity of cascading disasters. It is possible that Atlantis was never meant as a real land, but as a parable of fragility. Civilizations can vanish in a night, and when they do, their stories dissolve alongside them. Flood, fire, pestilence, each is a face of the same truth. The great silence after catastrophe leaves only fragments, and those fragments become myths. And so, as the sea continues to conceal its secrets, we are left to imagine ruins not only beneath waves, but beneath memory itself. The catastrophe that hid Atlantis may not have been water alone, but the union of drowning and fever, leaving behind the most enduring scar of all: silence. Every human carries within their cells a record of survival. Our genomes are not merely blueprints for eyes and bones. They are palimpsests of forgotten catastrophes, written and rewritten through millennia. Where history is silent, DNA speaks, and sometimes its whispers tell of plagues so ancient, so devastating, that no story remains, only the genetic shadows of those who endured. One such shadow is the population bottleneck of roughly 70,000 years ago. Genetic studies suggest humanity nearly vanished, reduced to perhaps only a few thousand breeding individuals. Many attribute this to the Toba supereruption and the volcanic winter that followed. Yet climate alone may not explain the severity of the collapse. Some scientists propose that waves of epidemic preying on weakened populations delivered the deeper blow. If true, then our species was shaped as much by microbes as by fire and ice. The scars of that near extinction are still visible in the reduced diversity of our genome, as though a hand once pressed hard upon humanity's throat, and only a whisper of us survived. But the genetic imprints are not confined to prehistory. They ripple closer to our own time. Studies of European DNA reveal traces of selective pressure during the Black Death. Certain immune system genes, particularly variants linked to the functioning of macrophages and inflammatory responses, became more common, suggesting survivors passed on resistance. Yet this advantage came with a price. Those same mutations are today associated with autoimmune disorders like Crohn's disease. The irony is chilling. The same resilience that once protected against plague may now turn the body against itself. Survival reshaped us, but not always for the better. Elsewhere, different populations carry their own genetic legacies. In West Africa, genetic resistance to malaria shaped whole lineages, though it came paired with conditions like sickle cell disease. In parts of South America, researchers find hints of ancient viral footprints embedded in indigenous genomes, as if forgotten epidemics left behind faint signatures of survival. These hidden records remind us that disease has never been an equal burden. Each region, each people, carries its own archive of struggles, successes, and losses, inscribed not in books, but in blood. Then there are the ghost populations. Geneticists speak of them cautiously, ancestral groups that once lived, but whose traces survive only as fragments woven into modern DNA. No artifacts, no monuments, no clear identity. Just spectral echoes. Some may have been absorbed by larger groups through migration. Others may have been erased entirely by disease, their voices silenced so completely that only a thread of genome remains. Imagine entire cultures, languages, ways of life vanishing under waves of epidemic, leaving nothing but faint markers hidden in our chromosomes. Our bodies carry them unknowingly, a silent inheritance from those who endured or perished. The genome itself bears the marks of viral battles. Human DNA contains countless sequences derived from ancient viruses, endogenous retroviruses, the remnants of infections that, long ago, inserted themselves into germline cells and became permanent residents. These viral fossils make up nearly 8% of our genome. They are relics of past invasions, showing that humanity has always lived not alone, but entangled with unseen companions. Many of these sequences are inactive, broken remnants, yet some still influence our biology, shaping immunity, pregnancy, even the development of the placenta. Disease has not merely threatened us, it has written itself into our very design. It is sobering to realize that every breath we take, every heartbeat, carries within it echoes of ancient plague. We are not simply the descendants of survivors, we are mosaics of their struggles, our bodies etched with the memory of epidemics long forgotten. Each of us is a living archive, carrying both the strengths that allowed our ancestors to endure and the weaknesses born of compromise. Even myths may hint at this genetic silence. Tales of vanished tribes, the 10 lost tribes of Israel, the mysterious sea peoples, the forgotten builders of megaliths, may preserve cultural memories of peoples who succumbed to waves of illness. What history records as disappearance, genetics preserves as faint survival. The stories say they vanished. The genome says they are still here, hidden like ghosts in the fabric of who we are. The silence within us is not empty. It is full of stories we cannot remember, of battles fought before history, of epidemics that shaped our destiny without leaving a trace in stone. The bones of Mohenjo-Daro may crumble, the glyphs of the Maya may fade, but the blood that flows through us remembers. This realization invites us to see civilization differently. Our cities, our empires, our monuments are fragile, but our bodies, fragile too, endure in another way, as vessels of memory. Long after scrolls have burned and temples have fallen, the DNA of survivors carries the imprint of the catastrophes they endured. We are the children of plague as much as of invention. And when we consider the cycles of collapse and renewal, the hourglass of history turning over and over, it is within us that the most faithful record lies. Every immune response, every inherited gene, every silent fragment of viral code is a reminder that the true chronicle of civilization is not only written in stone or ink, but in flesh. In the stories of collapse, humans are rarely alone. Around us, hidden in the thickets and burrows, in the wings of birds and the fur of beasts, live the reservoirs of plague. Civilizations fall, cities crumble, but these carriers endure, holding within them the seeds of future catastrophes. They are the quiet custodians of cycles, waiting in the shadows for moments when human society grows dense enough, interconnected enough, to ignite the spark of pandemic. Consider the marmots of Central Asia. For centuries, hunters knew that handling their pelts or eating their meat could bring sudden death. Folktales warned of animals cursed by the earth itself, to be avoided at all costs. Modern science confirms what folklore long suspected. These marmots harbour Yersinia pestis, the bacterium of plague. From their burrows on the steppes, the disease travelled with caravans, fleas and rats along the Silk Road, slipping invisibly from one empire to another. The Black Death itself may have had its cradle in these small burrowing creatures, whose survival strategies inadvertently scripted the fate of continents. The prairie dogs of North America tell a similar story. Colonies of these animals still harbour plague bacteria today, their populations rising and falling in waves of sudden mortality. The landscape itself, pocked with abandoned burrows, bears silent witness to the presence of a disease older than fences and farms. Ranchers and farmers occasionally stumble upon sudden die-offs, entire colonies wiped out in days, reminding us that plague remains alive, biding its time beneath the soil. And then there are rats, the most infamous of companions. In medieval Europe, black rats and their fleas carried plague through ports, cities, and villages, feeding on humanity's proximity. Yet rats were not simply villains. They were opportunists, thriving where humans stored grain, where refuse piled up, where cities grew dense. In a sense, they were mirrors of us, creatures that multiplied in the niches civilization carved, flourishing in the warmth of our fire and the abundance of our scraps. Our downfall became their opportunity, and through them the microbe found its highways. Bats form another shadowed lineage of carriers. Across cultures, they have been both feared and revered. In China, bats symbolize fortune, yet also dwell in caves that evoke underworlds. In the Americas, the bat god Camazotz was a figure of death. Today we know bats as reservoirs for coronaviruses, filoviruses, and countless other pathogens. Their dense colonies and vast migratory flights allow microbes to pass silently through generations, waiting for contact with humans to open a new chapter of contagion. Myths of winged demons or harbingers of night may reflect humanity's ancient intuition that bats carried something uncanny, something dangerous hidden in the folds of their wings. Other animals, too, have carried the invisible. Camels in the Middle East, with their role in desert caravans, host coronaviruses like MERS. Pigs, with their uncanny ability to incubate and mix influenza strains, have been at the crossroads of many epidemics. Even birds, from chickens to migratory flocks, have served as vessels for contagion, stitching together distant regions with the thread of disease carried on their wings. Throughout history, societies sensed this connection, even without microscopes. Rituals targeted animals suspected of harbouring death. In medieval Europe, cats were slaughtered in the belief that they spread plague, an error that allowed rats to flourish unchecked, worsening the very problem people sought to solve. In Asia, hunting bans or taboos often arose after epidemics, attempts to protect communities from creatures whose danger was only half understood. These taboos, encoded in religion or custom, acted as cultural quarantines, shaping diets and behaviours in ways that sometimes offered real protection. The pattern reveals something unsettling. Pandemics are not merely human events, they are ecological. They emerge from the tangled web of species living side by side, each carrying microbes shaped by millions of years of coexistence. When humans push further into forests, drain wetlands, or crowd animals into markets, we redraw boundaries that once kept pathogens contained. Every shift in ecology is an invitation, a new bridge for disease to cross. To imagine this is to see the world not as a stable stage for humanity, but as a living system where invisible currents are always moving. A hunter handling a marmot on the steppe, a farmer raising pigs beside his family's hut, a merchant unloading grain as rats scurry unseen, a bat darting from a cave at dusk, brushing against a fruit tree. Each moment holds the possibility of exchange, breath, blood, saliva, flea bite, and from such ordinary encounters, history may be reset. Civilizations that survived plague often sought to ritualize their defenses. Some burned fields or homes to cleanse spaces thought infected. Others banished animals, drove them out with noise or fire. Communities that endured understood in their bones that the boundary between human and non-human was porous, fragile, and dangerous. Survival meant not only defending against armies or storms, but against the creatures in whose company humanity had always lived. These carriers remind us that history's great erasures were not the work of microbes alone, but of ecologies intertwined with human ambition. Cities, farms, and trade routes created the conditions. Animals provided the reservoirs. Microbes seized the opportunity. To walk through ruins is to realize that plague was never ours alone. It was always shared, born of the contact zones between species, a chorus of lives entangled in silence and shadow. When the invisible enemy moved through villages and cities, humanity responded not only with fear, but with ritual. These acts, half spiritual and half practical, became the fragile defences against an unseen force. They are echoes of how societies attempted to survive resets, weaving myth and necessity into gestures that might keep death at bay. In medieval Europe, when plague bells tolled, entire towns organised processions of prayer. Flagellants marched barefoot through the streets, whipping themselves until their backs bled, believing their suffering could appease God's anger. At crossroads and fields, stone plague crosses were raised, markers of spaces sanctified against contagion. Even as carts carried the dead by the hundreds, people clung to the idea that symbolic boundaries could hold back the tide. Yet rituals were not always symbolic. In Venice, the word 40 giorni, 40 days, gave us the term quarantine. Ships arriving at port were held offshore, their sailors waiting out an invisible sentence of time before stepping on land. This practice, born of necessity, became one of the most effective measures against plague, though its logic was cloaked in religious numbers and ritual observance. Quarantine houses were often marked with painted crosses, the colour red searing a warning into the streetscape. Behind those doors, silence reigned, broken only by coughing. Across the world, similar practices emerged. In Japan, shrines dedicated to Gozu Tenno, a deity associated with pestilence, became centres of ritual purification. Offerings were made, prayers whispered, as communities sought divine favour. In India, villagers worshipped Shitala, the goddess of smallpox, offering cooling foods and waters to soothe her wrath. Mothers brought their children before her image, asking her not to disfigure their faces or steal their lives. These rituals were as much communal therapy as divine negotiation, binding survivors together when logic could not explain their suffering. Among Native American peoples, purification often took the form of fire and smoke. Sweat lodges, burning herbs, and ritual isolation were used to cleanse both body and spirit. Some communities, facing epidemic waves after European contact, revived ancient ceremonies with renewed intensity. Illness was not only a physical disruption, but a breach of balance with the natural and spiritual worlds. Purification was therefore a restoration, an attempt to knit reality back together. Archaeology reveals that such responses were not limited to words and prayer. In certain plague pits, bodies were sprinkled with lime, an act part practical, part ritual, both to control odour and to sanctify the dead. In abandoned settlements, evidence of burned homes suggests attempts to cleanse spaces where disease had struck. Fire became both purifier and eraser, leaving behind a silence in which survivors could rebuild. In Icelandic sagas, descriptions of entire farms burned for cleansing may well be memories of such practices. These rituals mattered because they gave form to fear. They turned chaos into action, despair into practice. Even if microbes remained unseen, the human need for meaning crafted defences both symbolic and real. Sometimes they worked. Quarantine slowed contagion. Purification reduced exposure. Faith bound communities together when terror might have torn them apart. But the rituals could also divide. In plague-stricken Europe, suspicion often fell on outsiders, Jews, lepers, foreigners, accused of poisoning wells or angering God. Pogroms and persecutions became grim rituals of their own, born of desperation and ignorance. These responses remind us that fear, when unshaped by understanding, can turn ritual into violence. Survival strategies were not always protective. Sometimes they carried their own scars. Still, the resilience of ritual is remarkable. From the painted crosses of Venetian doors to the smoke-filled lodges of the Americas, from the offerings to Shitala to the chants in Japanese shrines, each gesture carried the same underlying impulse: to restore a sense of order in the face of overwhelming disorder. They were bridges across terror, affirmations that humanity could still act, still choose, even when surrounded by silence. And through repetition, these rituals became memory. They carried forward the experience of plague into culture, ensuring that the next generation would inherit not only the fear, but the practices of survival. Stories of ancestors who prayed, purified, and endured helped communities face later epidemics with a sense of continuity. What science could not yet provide, culture preserved. In the quiet of ruined villages, Where pestilence once walked unseen, traces of these acts still linger. A burned threshold, a carved stone, a forgotten shrine. They are the echoes of people who tried to push back against the tide, who sought survival in gestures as fragile as breath, yet as enduring as memory. History often presents itself as a thread. Kings succeeding kings, dynasties rising and falling, chronicles stretching without interruption. But if you look closely, the thread frays. Pages are missing, inscriptions fall silent, entire centuries seem to vanish into haze. These are not always accidents of neglect. Sometimes they are the fingerprints of plague, erasing memory as efficiently as fire. Take the Maya. Their monuments once rose across the jungles of Central America, carved with glyphs recording wars, rituals, and royal lineages. Yet around the 9th century, these inscriptions grow sparse. Temples stand unfinished, stelae remain blank, dynastic records stop mid-line. Scholars point to drought, warfare, and shifting trade as causes of collapse. Yet epidemics may also have played their part. A society weakened by hunger and unrest would have been especially vulnerable to waves of disease. The silence in the glyphs may reflect not only failing kingship, but communities struck too quickly to carve their own endings. The Late Bronze Age tells a similar story. Around 1200 BCE, great civilizations, the Mycenaeans, the Hittites, the cities of the Levant, collapsed in rapid succession. Archaeologists find evidence of burning, migrations, and warfare, yet written records thin to almost nothing. Letters stop mid-correspondence, archives cease. Could waves of plague have swept through, magnifying the shocks of famine and invasion, silencing not only cities but scribes? In Hattusa, the Hittite capital, clay tablets lie abandoned, their stories interrupted, as though the hands that pressed them into clay suddenly fell still. Even in Europe, where monastic scribes prided themselves on continuity, gaps appear. The 14th century, heavy with plague, is marked by chronicles that simply stop. In some abbeys, a single hand copies text until suddenly there is no more. The scribe, like his brethren, was taken by the pestilence. Entire local histories ended with the death of those who would have recorded them. What we call the silence of the archives is often not neglect, but the abrupt end of a life. These voids extend beyond texts into culture itself. Languages vanish when speakers are lost. Oral traditions dissolve when storytellers die. Technologies are forgotten when artisans perish before passing on their craft. Consider the art of Roman mosaics, the engineering of Inca rope bridges, or the medicinal knowledge of countless indigenous groups. How many techniques, songs, and remedies disappeared not by slow fading, but by sudden erasure. The plague does not only claim bodies, it tears holes in continuity, leaving future generations to stumble over gaps they cannot fill. Sometimes the void itself becomes legend. The so-called Dark Ages of Europe are remembered as centuries of lost knowledge, a dimming of light between Rome and Renaissance. While warfare and politics explain much, epidemic disease surely magnified the forgetting. Each wave of pestilence left fewer teachers, fewer scribes, fewer artisans to carry traditions forward. In China too, dynastic transitions often coincided with outbreaks, leaving archives destroyed or abandoned, and gaps in the narrative of continuity. The Ming dynasty rose in the 14th century amid the aftermath of plague that had swept across Eurasia, its founding shadowed by memory of erasure. And beyond written history, there are the absences in archaeology, civilizations hinted at by a scatter of pottery, a wall foundation, a few burials, cultures that seem to bloom suddenly and vanish just as quickly. Scholars speculate about migration, assimilation, natural disaster. But the possibility of plague, swift and devastating, always hovers in the background. Entire peoples may have dissolved so completely that only a trace in soil chemistry or a shard of bone remains. What is most haunting is how silence itself becomes fertile ground. Myths grow where history falls quiet. Forgotten centuries invite legends of golden ages lost, of kingdoms swallowed whole, of mysterious peoples erased. The disappearance of records does not leave emptiness, it leaves space for imagination. Atlantis, Tartaria, vanished tribes, all may be cultural attempts to give shape to the blank spaces plague carved into the past. It is easy to think of memory as fragile parchment or brittle stone, but the deeper truth is that memory lives in the presence of people. When they are gone, memory goes with them. Plague has the power to sever those chains in an instant. A community can pass down a song for 1,000 years, but if one generation is struck hard enough, the song ends forever. The silence left behind is not merely absence, it is a wound in time. To walk among ruins, to leaf through half-finished manuscripts, to hear stories of vanished tribes, is to sense this silence pressing close. It is not the silence of peace, but of interruption, of something that ended too soon. And that silence, multiplied across centuries, reminds us that history is not a smooth river, but a landscape broken by sinkholes, each one carved by invisible tides of disease. Civilizations often imagine themselves eternal. Rome called itself the Eternal City. The Chinese dynasties claimed the mandate of heaven. Modern nations speak of progress as if it were a straight line, unbroken and unending. Yet when we step back, the record of the past looks less like a line and more like an hourglass. Civilizations fill with energy, culture and growth, only to be turned upside down, emptied by forces beyond their control. Among these forces, plague is one of the most consistent grains of sand. Rome fell not in one night but in stages, many of them marked by pestilence. The Antonine Plague hollowed its armies, the Plague of Cyprian weakened its provinces, the later waves of plague frayed its economic fabric. By the time barbarian tribes pressed against its borders, Rome was already brittle. The hourglass had already begun to turn, and each outbreak of disease tilted it further. China's dynasties tell a parallel story. The Han, weakened by waves of epidemic, lost its grip and gave way to centuries of fragmentation. Centuries later, the Tang faced its own declines amid outbreaks, their golden age dimmed by pestilence that stalked alongside rebellion. Records from the Ming dynasty describe entire provinces losing half their population to sudden illnesses, leaving granaries unguarded, fields untilled, and armies undermanned. The lesson repeats. Heavenly mandate or imperial decree could not protect against the shadows carried on breath and skin. The Maya, too, endured cycles of flourishing and silence. Cities such as Tikal and Copan rose in grandeur only to fall still, their plazas emptied, their glyphs ceasing mid-line. Scholars debate drought, warfare and trade collapse, but the pattern of sudden abandonment hints at something swifter. Pestilence could have been the hand that tipped the scales, the invisible wave that scattered populations already living on fragile margins. The Indus Valley holds the same riddle. For centuries its cities thrived on irrigation and order, then with shocking rapidity they declined. Streets once washed clean by advanced drainage became littered with the dead. Whether plague was the prime mover or a companion to environmental shifts, it left its scar in the archaeological record. An hourglass overturned, its sand spilling too quickly to be explained by climate alone. The recurrence of collapse shaped the way cultures understood time itself. Hindu cosmology speaks of yugas, vast cycles of creation and decline, where plague and famine inevitably signal the approach of darkness before renewal. Norse mythology envisioned Ragnarok, where fire, frost and sickness sweep away the old to make room for the new. In these stories, the hourglass is not merely metaphor but cosmology. The belief that resets are woven into the very fabric of existence. Even in the myths of smaller communities, echoes of the hourglass appear. Pacific Islanders tell of worlds lost to waves and fevers, after which new settlements were founded as if life itself had been inverted. Native American traditions describe pestilence spirits who walk the land in cycles, thinning populations so that balance with nature can be restored. Each story is a reminder that plague was not seen as an anomaly, but as an expected turn in the rhythm of life. The metaphor of sand is especially fitting. Each life lost is a grain falling, silent but inexorable. At first the flow is gentle, barely noticed. Then as the epidemic peaks, it rushes downward in torrents until the upper chamber is empty and the lower brims with silence. When the hourglass is turned, survivors begin again, but never with the same shape as before. The sands are altered, shifted, mixed with remnants of the last collapse. What makes this image so haunting is its inevitability. The records of empires show that plague returned not once, but many times, with a rhythm almost as steady as the seasons. Cities were rebuilt, fields replanted, monuments raised, only for the invisible tide to rise again, sweeping away certainty. Survivors carried fragments of knowledge, resilience, and scars, but they could not halt the turning of the glass. Seen through this lens, history is not a march of progress, but a spiral. Each cycle of rise and fall leaves echoes in the next, traces carried forward in genes, myths, ruins, and rituals. Civilizations climb, collapse, and climb again, never in quite the same way, but always with the shadow of pestilence woven into their ascent. And so the recurring hourglass teaches a lesson often forgotten, that permanence is an illusion. What seems eternal can be emptied in a generation. The stones of Rome, the walls of Chang'an, the pyramids of the Maya, all once stood as if forever, and all were touched by silence when the sands ran out. To look upon their ruins today is to feel the weight of that rhythm pressing on us still. The year was 1918. Across the trenches of Europe, soldiers huddled in mud, exhausted by war. They had survived gas shells, artillery, and the endless stalemate of machine guns. Yet the deadliest enemy was not bullets, but something far smaller. A virus that spread on the wind, carried by coughs and whispers. The Spanish flu circled the globe in months, killing an estimated 50 million people, more than the war itself. Entire towns lost half their inhabitants in a season. Mass graves filled once again, echoing the plague pits of centuries past. Its reach was merciless. In Alaska, small communities of indigenous peoples were nearly extinguished in days, their villages left eerily silent. In India, funeral pyres burned without pause as millions succumbed. In American cities, bodies were stacked in makeshift morgues when undertakers ran out of coffins. The war had taught humanity to count death in numbers, but the influenza forced them to reckon with loss in silence. Empty chairs, interrupted generations, homes where laughter vanished overnight. This was no medieval relic. This was the 20th century, a world of trains, telegrams, and telephones. Modern medicine existed, yet the virus still slipped past defences. The same patterns unfolded. Social orders strained, economies shook, rituals of mourning multiplied. Survivors rebuilt as they always had, carrying scars both physical and cultural. Some families avoided ever speaking of 1918, the trauma buried in silence. Others wove it into law, remembering it as the shadow that walked after the guns fell quiet. The 21st century has shown us that the rhythm continues. The emergence of SARS in 2003, Ebola outbreaks in West Africa, and the global shock of COVID-19 remind us that plague is not consigned to the past. Within months, COVID-19 circled the planet, emptying streets from New York to New Delhi. Nations faltered, economies slowed, lives shifted into unfamiliar patterns of isolation. The world rediscovered words like quarantine and lockdown, echoes of Venice's 40 days on the water. Modern cities became ghost towns, skyscrapers looming over deserted streets, subways running almost empty, the hum of daily life replaced by silence. And just as in antiquity, these modern pandemics reveal fragility. They do not only kill, they expose the weak points in our structures. In 1918, exhausted armies carried disease across continents. In 2020, airplanes and global trade became the vessels. Both then and now, plague exploited our very networks of connection. It reminded us that what we build to unite us can also spread shadows faster than we can see. Science has given us tools the ancients could not imagine. Vaccines, microscopes, genomic sequencing. Yet even with these, the rhythm persists. Mortality rates may lessen, responses may be swifter, but the truth remains that humanity is bound to a living planet, woven into ecosystems filled with reservoirs and carriers. Each leap from animal to human is a reminder that we are never alone, that the invisible world still shapes us as it always has. The echoes of past pandemics resurface in how we live now. Masked faces on subways recall woodcuts of medieval plague doctors in their bird-like masks. Streets sprayed with disinfectant echo rituals of smoke and fire once used to cleanse villages. Modern hospitals filled beyond capacity carry the same weight as monasteries once overwhelmed by Black Death victims. The tools change, but the pattern endures. Beyond loss, pandemics alter the trajectory of societies. The Spanish flu weakened colonial structures as populations reeled from mass mortality, subtly accelerating demands for independence. COVID-19 has reshaped economies, hastening automation, shifting education online, altering work forever. Each wave of plague leaves behind not only graves, but transformations, new ways of living born out of necessity. These changes may feel temporary, but history suggests they harden into new foundations. The warning of the present is not a new fear, but an old one rediscovered. History's hourglass turns again and again. The cycle breathes still. Empires, kingdoms, and nations that once believed themselves immune learn that fragility is timeless. We, too, carry that lesson in our streets, our homes, our memories of emptied cities. When silence descends again, whether tomorrow or in 100 years, future generations may look back at our ruins and our genomes, just as we look upon ancient bones and deserted villages. They will find the same story written in different words, that humanity flourished, faltered, endured, and began again, each time marked by the shadow of plague. Dawn breaks over ruins that once belonged to empires. Grass grows between the stones. Birds nest in the cracks of walls that once echoed with voices. There is no smoke of battle here, no memory of conquest carved into tablets. Only stillness. And yet, in that stillness, something breathes. The echo of cycles that have repeated since humanity first gathered around fire. We like to imagine collapse as fire and thunder, armies clashing, floods swallowing cities, mountains shattering. But often it comes as a whisper, a cough in the marketplace, a fever behind closed doors, invisible until it is everywhere. Then just as quickly, silence. Fields untended, temples abandoned, inscriptions unfinished. The survivors move on, leaving behind stones and questions. Plagues have always been with us. They are written in our bones, in the bottlenecks of our DNA. They are carved into myths of wrathful gods, carried by animals that live in our shadows, sealed into ice that remembers when even the air grew still. Each reset is not the end, but a turn of the hourglass. What we call history is the record of what survived the turning. Perhaps that is why ruins feel alive at dawn, why myths linger with uncanny weight, why our bodies carry both strength and fragility. We are the children of survivors, heirs to cycles we scarcely remember, and one day, long after our time, others may walk among our ruins and wonder what silenced us. Will they speak of wars, of floods, of fire? Or will they suspect, as we now do, that the true eraser was something unseen, a shadow in the breath? As the sun rises higher, the ruins fade back into silence. The stones endure, but the questions remain. History has never been a straight line. It folds, it erases, it begins again. And in the spaces between, the silence breathes, waiting for us to listen. If you've travelled this far with me, carrying these whispers of plague and memory, I invite you to linger a little longer. Like, subscribe, and share these stories, so that when silence comes again, memory will endure in new voices. Where are you listening from tonight, and at what time?